As we move now to the end of the traditional Jesus, I had suggested the need for an important shift in our thinking, that we move away from metaphysics to the language of character, that we move from the language of ontology to the language of narrative. Now, this is nothing new. I'm not suggesting something that hasn't been suggested for 40 years. This was a major move made back in the 1980s. With the beginning in early 90s, with the beginning of what was called narrative theology. But the roots of this narrative theology that arises in the 80s and 90s comes from a stream or a tradition that is influenced by Karl Barth. Because one of the things that Barth does in his Christology, in the Church Dogmatics, the book 4, particularly volume 2, is he opens up the question of Christology to the question of the narrative life of Jesus. He reads now all Christology, what we're going to call the doctrine of Christology, through this narrative lens, particularly in book 4, volume 2. Okay. But if we are willing to pursue this business of the distinction or the difference, or however you want to play that up, between metaphysics, character, ontology, narrative, and plot, if we're willing to make that shift, here's what becomes really, really important. As I mentioned last week, a major flaw, and it's a significant flaw, in the early church fathers is they don't have an anthropology. And the anthropology they do have is simply inherited from Platonism. That's it. It's just taken over, lock, stock, and barrel. All these philosophical categories that are in the air, so to speak, that people are breathing and living in intellectually. It's like fish in water. Fish don't know they're in water. They're just in water. The people of that time are just saturated with this, so there's no anthropology here. And so when it comes to a conversation about who the man Jesus is, all they could do is resort to abstract categories now and talk about two natures, two wills, one mind, two minds. They're stuck in that faculty psychology, and they're unable then to have any kind of a doctrine of incarnation where divinity, the identity and character of God, can become revealed in and through the identity and character of a human being. They have no ability to bridge that gap. That's what creates Gnosticism. Gnostics cannot bridge that gap from the divine to the human. The gospel can and does, but Christian Gnosticism is never able to bridge that gap. It cannot become earthly, it cannot become real. That explains why all Gnostic forms of Christianity from the 2nd century to the 21st century have nothing to do with discipleship. You can't be a Gnostic and be a disciple. If you're a Gnostic, you're saved by secret knowledge and you're working your way up the Masonic ladder of the ancient world until you get to that wonderful mystic 33rd order, and then you get some divine revelation of whatever it is, and then what's left behind is utter nonsense. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to read the Nag Hammadi library, and I've never quite understood scholars that seem to love the early Christian Gnostics, because most of what's actually there in the Nag Hammadi library is superstition mixed with folklore, mixed with a little bit of Bible and a lot of paganism. That's all it is. If you just read the documents through the various gospels through, and you got to try that sometime. Spend a day just reading in the Nag Hammadi library, and you'll come away and understand Gnostics are unable to connect to reality. And that's where we're at Christianity. And that's why it's so very, very important that we not only have this narrative life of Jesus, 4 of them, but we also have this narrative life, this pattern that's been given to us in that didache, that ethical substratum that we've talked about, where the church follows Jesus. Okay, so that's where we're at in this. I want to now focus us a little bit further. I talked about shifting from categories that are Platonic to Jewish categories when it comes to anthropology, but I want to pursue this a step further. I had mentioned Yaroslav Pelikan's Jesus Through the Centuries some time back, and how there's this shift in the portrait of Jesus as we move through each Christian century. Well, if there was a shift in the portrait of Jesus in the 21st century, one would have to say that, or the 20th century, one would have to say that we now have come to know Jesus the Jew. We didn't before, but now we do. Before, all we knew was Jesus the first Christian, or Jesus the perfect sacrifice, or Jesus the rather strange, enigmatic parable speaker and miracle worker. But Jesus the Jew we did not know. Most Christians assume that if you want to know what Judaism was like in Jesus' day, you just read the Old Testament. As though somehow the Hebrew scriptures that are written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus are a reflection of Jesus' culture and society. That, of course, is a fallacy. So we have to ask questions. If we're going to talk about the humanity of God, or the humanity of God in Jesus, or the humanity of Jesus, we have to ask primary questions. And one of those primary questions is, what do we do with Jesus' Jewishness? What do we do with it? It is a fact in Galatians 4:4, as Paul says, that it was at the right time that Jesus was born of a woman, born under Torah. Two very significant statements by the Apostle Paul about Jesus, the Jew. But what do we do with Jesus' Jewishness? Is it essential? Is it an essential part of what it means for him to be human? Do we need to bring over questions of Jewish identity into those of Christian identity? How do we handle Jesus' Jewishness? Do we turn it into a fetish, as something to be followed like Messianic Jewish congregations do? Do we dispense with it and ignore it altogether, or even try to lift Jesus out of it, as the German Christians did? They de-Judaized Jesus. Most of Christendom has done that, by the way. And what does it mean to talk about Jesus' Jewishness if it doesn't really matter? Because if Jesus' Jewishness mattered, the Apostle Paul would have made it clear that we needed to be Jews in order to understand Jesus, but that's not the case. The imitation or the following of Jesus has nothing to do with his Judaism. It has everything to do with how he is perceived in the church as the true human, which we'll talk about next week, and which Jesus himself talked about. But we have to understand that as we talk about Jesus' humanness, as we come to know Jesus the human, what we are really talking about is a first century Galilean Jew. And you and I have about as much acquaintance with the culture and life and ethos of first century Galilean Judaism as we do of 6th century Arthurian England. It's out of our grasp. We can't even imagine it. And what that means for us is that Jesus is always going to be encountered as a bit strange. This is very important. When you read the Gospels, if you are reading the Gospels, and from time to time you don't stumble, you're reading a text where Jesus will make a certain saying about eunuchs, or a certain saying about divorce, or a certain teaching about this or that, and if it just doesn't break your brain, then you're not listening. Because the Jewish Jesus is living and dwelling in a world where halakhic decisions, legal decisions are being made all the time so that we can do the will of God so that God will bless the people. That's very important. And those aren't our decisions. We have whole different sets of decisions to be making, but those aren't our decisions. So what do? Well, we talk about Jesus' Jewishness. What I'm going to do now is just flip through book titles. Don't worry about it. This is it's a method of lecturing I saw about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe more than that, maybe 15 years ago. And I've done it now once or twice, and I just absolutely love it, just flipping through book titles. You can write them down if you want, but this is James Charlesworth, and I'm just using the titles as points. So when we talk about Jesus' Jewishness, what really are we talking about, folks? Number one, we have to recognize that Judaism as a religion is different than Christianity. Judaism doesn't do Jesus, Palestinian Judaism doesn't do Platonic metaphysics the way someone in Alexandria, like Philo of Alexandria, would do, for example. Jesus had a specific type of Jewish environment he grew up in. He doesn't grow up in the capital city of Jerusalem. He grows up in the outskirts of Galilee, and Galilee had been forcibly converted about 150 years prior to Judaism. And Galilee is known as a hotbed, a seedbed for rebels and rebellions. And so we're talking about a specific kind of Jewishness, a Galilean Jewishness. We're not talking about the same kind of environment the writer of the fourth gospel grew up in. That writer is well-educated, upper class, very probably a priest, certainly an expert in Jewish traditions, very different than Jesus in the backwoods of Galilee. And when I say backwoods, I wouldn't want you to think that Jesus was a country bumpkin, because he did spend a fair amount of time in Sepphoris and Capernaum, both which would have been major Hellenistic cities in Galilee, and Jesus would not have been unacquainted with urban life. So what we do is we place Jesus within Judaism. There's the title of another Charlesworth book, if you want it. That's very, very good. And we learn to see Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes, okay? That's Kenneth Bailey's book. That's what we're doing. That's all we're doing. We need to take off these Western glasses. We need to put on Jewish glasses. And the only way we're going to do that is, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, is if we immerse ourselves in Second Temple Judaism. That's Jesus Judaism. It would be akin to someone trying to write your story or your biography 2,000 years from now, who knew nothing about 20th century American Christian and 21st century American Christian religion and where it was at, the issues it was dealing with. So where does that put us with Jesus? This one who sits at the right hand of the Father, this one who is the agent of creation, the one who is the final word. Where does that put us with this historical figure? Well, again, none of this is set in stone, but it is a corrective to a Gnostic Jesus. If you're Gnostic, you will tend to be anti-Semitic. And you can almost always detect Gnosticism if you can detect anti-Semitism, because you can't be anti-Semitic and be a Gnostic. You can be anti-Semitic and a lot of other things, but if you're Gnostic, you're automatically anti-Semitic, because your heaven can't touch earth. It never connects. We have this problem when it comes to Jesus, because when you look in the Gospels, what do you see? You see only from the baptism forward You see an itinerant preacher. He evidently at some point gains the followers, some leading ladies that will help support this emerging movement. He's apparently homeless. He's also apparently fatherless. That is, he's perceived as a bastard child, which means he has trouble even getting into temple unless he's got a family member to vouch for him. He has no money. He has no home. I mean, this sounds like a country song. If Jesus would have lost his dog, that would have been perfect, right? When you look at this Jesus, I mean, this is not somebody that you would follow today. You wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. You with me on this? This itinerant, evidently fairly apocalyptic type preacher whose message paralleled that of John the Baptist, and yet was distinct enough that Jesus could break away and form his own baptismal ritual right down the river in competition with John. I mean, would you follow this Jesus character? Really, would you follow him? The guy's broke. He's homeless. Are you going to follow him when he tells you, follow me? I wouldn't. And you wouldn't either. This is very important because our tendency is to view Jesus after the resurrection. Yes, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go. No. That's not how it works. If you're truly honest, you would say, I don't want to really know him. There's very little of interest to me there. But the fact is, on the other side of this, we do know him. And because we do know him, we follow him. And that is our epistemology, to know him. Only those who know him follow him. Only those who follow him know him. That's that Anabaptist dictum. I think it's Denk that said that. So when you come to Jesus, how do you see him? Do you see him as a theologian, a Jewish theologian, knowing that Jews don't do theology as such, not like Christians do? Jews do a lot of conversation in and around what constitutes Torah and what's proper halakha, but they don't do theology like we do. They don't have that Platonic metaphysics embedded within Judaism. It's not embedded within Talmud. So you could see Jesus as a chassid, as a holy man. Well, that is not much difference to perceive Jesus as a holy man, that is an ascetic, like John the Baptist. That's not much difference than perceiving him as a Merkabah mystic, or as a sage, or as a magician, or as a shaman. The Jesus that you and I follow, my friends, was a radical thinker. Okay, he was what did I do with the book? He was a radical thinker. That's what Jesus was. He was a holy man. So he's a radical thinker who's also a holy man, an ascetic. But he's also trained. And if he's not trained officially, which I don't think he was an autodidact, which means he was self-taught. And that makes him a person with authority, particularly in mysticism. But that same person is full of wisdom in the wisdom tradition and is thus a sage, and can cast out demons and raise the dead, which makes him all of the above. This is the Jesus we know, this Jesus that we can't wrap our hands around, this Jesus that we are told, don't cling to me. I've not yet ascended to my Father. The problem in right now, in particular in liberal Christianity, it's especially the case, but you can find it in certain conservative Christian circles too, is that people have identified Jesus with a certain kind of icon and they're clinging to it. Jesus breaks all the boundaries, folks. He is many things. Today, some might call him a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman. He was good at many, 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 many things. Whatever it was about Jesus, the fact is, he's an oddball. He's an oddball, my friends. He lived his life outside the bounds of a normal life. At some point, he makes a decision to not be the man of the household, to not be the one that takes Joseph's place. He makes a decision to wander, to learn. This could account for some of the animosity of James, who would have had to pick up the burden for the Joseph and Mary household. Jesus is so odd that his family thinks he is mentally deranged. Now, I don't know if you've ever been through this, where you've watched someone move into what we would call a form of mental derangement, whether it's Alzheimer's or dementia or just plain mental derangement, just having a nervous breakdown. Or you've been told that that's you. But it's pretty serious when it's your own family that says you're deranged. It's also pretty serious when the authorities accuse you of collusion with the dark side and of being demon possessed. And that's where your power is from. So you take homelessness, you add fatherlessness to that. Now you can add all the pejorative ways that Jesus was understood by those in his culture. And we could go on and on. And when you add that up, what do you have as a person? What could you have as a person? You could have someone that was bitter. You could have someone that wanted serious vengeance. You could have someone that was sociopathic. I mean, it's a lot of rejection to face, my friends. That's a lot of rejection to face. Your entire culture saying that you don't belong. You're an outsider, even your family. We want Jesus to identify with our humanity. That's what we want. His invitation is for us to come and identify with his. You try stepping in his shoes for a day. It's easy for him to step into yours. Our lives are cush. How bad do we have it? Oh, I got a fingernail breaking in half. I got to pray about it. That's about as tough as our day gets. But when we're invited into his humanity, into his life, we're invited into a life of rejection. I mean, it's a little wonder that the gospel writers will say that, quoting Isaiah, he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. In other words, Jesus lived a sucky life. He lived a sucky life. Jesus did not live life like the New Testament Apocrypha has it, where he is miraculously healing birds or zapping children to death when he's pissed off at them. No, this is a Jesus that underwent incredible struggles, because even as his family and society want him to play top dog in the family system now, be the father figure. There's another one, another father that's calling him. And the only way to find him is to leave Nazareth. And he does. Now, we don't have this story, but we know that it happens. The Lucan narrative of Jesus being found in the temple at age 12 ought to tell us enough that Jesus just didn't give a damn about what his mother or father said about where he should or shouldn't be. He didn't care. There were more important things to him, even at that age. I don't think he lessened his conviction as he grew older. He becomes much more focused on the reign of God, so much solely focused that he ends up becoming the very reign of God on earth. In his humanness, there is, listen carefully, in his humanness, there is no sin. And what I mean by that is this: we cannot say anything about what life was like for Jesus prior to his baptism. The Gospels don't give us any information. We can't. We can, perhaps like the writer to the Hebrews, reckon with Jesus having to learn. What did he learn? He learned obedience. How did he learn it? Through suffering. We can get that. We can see glimpses of the intellectual environments in which he would have learned from. But we're not given insight into that. We're only given insight from the ministry period. And in that period, he is innocent. That is, from the baptism forward, he only does the will of the Father. We don't know anything before that. We could speculate, but we don't know. But from the baptism forward, after the Father has been pleased to call him beloved Son, and in the middle of the ministry on Mount Tabor to say the same thing, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. And then in the Bat Kol, the voice from heaven, in John 12, again. And then, of course, in the resurrection. This is the real Jesus, okay? So what you need to do is allow yourself a certain level of freedom to be uncomfortable with historical Jesus research, because you're never going to land on anything that's going to be permanent or solid there. And when it comes to the textual Jesus, the Jesus is perceived by Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, we're also dealing with a fair amount of scholarship there. Even though we might be dealing with patristic or medieval writers as well, we're dealing with scholarship too. And so there's always going to be a tentativeness there. When it comes to the Jesus of the tradition, that he's both the Son of the Father and the Son of Man, so to speak, there is a certain strength to the Orthodox paradox and the Trinitarian hermeneutic, but they can't be realized from the outside rationally. They can only be experienced internally, which means, and this is going to sound utterly strange coming from me, so if Steve Crosby, don't shoot me on this one. But the real basis you have for trust is that you know you have heard the Father's voice and are following Jesus. It's your experience. But it's not experience of anything outside of this pattern of discipleship. That's what you know. That's what is known. That's the given. That's the life of Jesus you enter into, that pattern of what it's like to forgive the enemy, what it's like to pray for those who persecute you, what it's like to love the unloving, what it's like to be patient and kind and loyal and to let your yes be yes and your no be no. All of this lifestyle shift, relationality shift. And because there are all these shifts in the relationships, this forms new community known as ecclesia, a different way of relating, a different way of being, because we are all participating in this discipleship life. Thus, we are participating in Christ. We are one body. We are that earthly expression of his life. To talk about Jesus the Jew ultimately is going to lead to talking about the church as the incarnate word. That's how you get from talking about Jesus the Jew to the church as the living word. That's why in Knowing God, the last chapter of Knowing God brought together incarnation and discipleship and church and the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, all at the end, the last chapter. We don't start with incarnation like Athanasius or even my friend Brett Jersak and others. No, we start with cross like Paul, crucifix like Luther, cross, death. And then when we talk about the incarnation, it's not an abstract event. It's an event that includes us. And we become church in the incarnation because we are given that self-same spirit that Jesus was given. Incarnation and church, discipleship, the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, they are all four ways of saying the one thing. Christ in you, the hope of glory. That's it. That's how that measures out. Now, I want to take you on a little tour. Some of you are familiar with the homoi word group in Greek. Homoi means to be like. So we would have homoi sapiens, like a wise animal, okay? Homoi is used in the New Testament with reference to Jesus in both his divinity and his humanity. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, there we have, I better open it up before I say there we have. I can't quote it off the top of my head in Greek. Philippians 2:7. Here's the hymn beginning in verse 5. Who, Jesus, though he existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God to consist in the act of grasping, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, in the likeness of other human beings, in the likeness of other human beings, the homoiomati. And the frame, the schema, and he was found as an anthropos, as a human. Okay, so here, and homoioti refers to the likeness of Jesus with humans, as divine with humans. Now I want to show you the same sentence structure in Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, here's what we have. God achieved what the law could not because it was weakened through the flesh by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh. And concerning sin, he condemns sin in us. He condemns sin in the flesh so that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us. A couple of things about these two texts. In the first text, Paul says Jesus takes the form of a servant. And the next line is, in the likeness of other humans. So in other words, the humanness of Jesus, when we talk about the humanity of Jesus, we have to talk about it in terms of bottom tier, okay? Servant is the lowest person on the rung. You with me on this so far? The servant's the lowest person on the rung. in the likeness of other people. You're talking about Jesus' humanity being conceived in terms of the multitudes of those on the bottom. We already get this. We've got that with the homelessness. We got that with the fatherlessness, and the other things. Well, here's Paul expressing it in these caste categories where the servant is absolutely at the bottom. But it gets even better than that. It's not that Jesus just becomes a human being. In Romans, which was written before Philippians, Paul writes that Jesus was sent in the likeness of sinful flesh. What is sinful flesh? What is sinful flesh? What does Paul mean when he uses this term, sinful flesh? He says, concerning this sinful flesh, whatever he means by it, that he condemns by sending his son, see that? By sending his son in the likeness of sinful flesh. That is, it would appear to anyone from the outside that Jesus was no different than anybody else. Not just simply in the way he looked, but in the way he behaved. And concerning sin, condemns sin in the flesh. Notice in verse 4, it is that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us, which if you retrovert this backwards into the life of Jesus, it says that he is perceived as sinful, even though he is the one fulfilling only the righteous requirements of the law, not the unrighteous ones. Jesus' humanity is lived in his discipleship pattern as a fulfillment of the righteous requirements of the law. There are unrighteous requirements, friends. This is the problem with Torah. This is the problem of living with Torah. This is the problem of Judaism, and it's also the problem of Christianity, because both Judaism and Islam, all the monotheistic religions, have identified every single command of God as a command of God. They aren't distinguished between righteous requirements and unrighteous requirements. Here we have a human being who has spent his adult life puzzling these things out, learning to distinguish his Father's voice from the voice of God in general, his Father's will from the will of the gods or God in general, who has spent a lifetime listening and learning from the outside. And in this process is able to discern that which is true in the Torah from that which is false. And we've already seen this hermeneutic laid out over and over again. And now it's just lived in him and lived in us. That's it. You can't, to talk about Jesus' humanity, to talk about Jesus the Jew, again, is always to bring it back to us who are yoked with him, to us who imitate him, to us who are the storytellers of his story and the livers of his life. It's all about us. So we literally cling to Jesus the Jew. That's the earthiness. That's that rootedness that keeps us grounded in our own humanity. And at the same time, we hold loosely this Jewishness, knowing that that's not his identity. It's greater than that. When he is raised from the dead, he doesn't become just King of the Jews, he becomes Lord of all. Next week, we're going to pay particular attention to how Jesus understands his human vocation. And we're going to take a dive into the Son of Man sayings. Then the following week, we're going to end this whole discussion by observing that Jesus, to quote Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, but Bonhoeffer came up with this phrase first. Jesus is the human who exists for other humans. And we're going to see a way of life, a model of life that is not in the world, friends, and can only have come by divine revelation. A way of living, being, doing, being church together, being body together, where this thing that we started out with, which was trust, just trust in the Father, it now becomes life together. That's where we'll end up in 2 weeks. So I will look forward to seeing you then.